what's up guys? In today's video, I'm going to show you all the gear that I use for looping on my Twitch channel. I'm Justine, I'm a music streamer. I've been streaming on Twitch since 2019 and I get a lot of questions about the software I use, the Midi controllers, and kind of how they all work together. When I first started streaming, I didn't know how to loop. All I had was my Scarlett Solo interface, my hand-me-down PC from my husband, and my electric violin. Then over the years, I started accumulating more gear from donation goals on Twitch and just support from the community. So shout out to all the people that helped me get all this gear, and if it wasn't for you guys, I wouldn't be here. So that's the awesome thing about live streaming on Twitch is you can start with what you got and then you can build on it as you go. So before we get into this video, if you're not subscribed to my channel, hit that subscribe button and be sure to like this video if you enjoy this content. And with that, let's get into it. In this video, I'm going to show you the instruments and the MIDI controllers that I use for looping in Ableton and kind of how they all work together. So I'll put some timestamps in the description so you can kind of skip around to different parts in the video if you want. Real quick, I want to talk about options for looping. So you could either use a pedal, like a Boss pedal, a Boss 404, a Boss 505, something like that, or you can go the Ableton route. I chose Ableton because of the expandability and being able to play around with different electronic sounds and effects. But it's totally up to you and your preference. I first started with the Boss RC1 pedal and quickly realized for me, I wanted to switch. So don't be afraid to try some different things out and see what works best for you and your kind of workflow as a musician. Okay, so let's first talk about instruments. I mentioned first that I started with just an electric violin. I ended up getting a DPA 4099 violin microphone for my acoustic violin so I could add that into my mix of instruments. It just kind of clips onto the side and then you can record with that microphone. It sounds super nice. The other instruments I use are my Fender HSS electric guitar, and then I have an acoustic electric Taylor guitar, and an Arturia electric keyboard, and then I use some other percussion instruments like various shakers and things. But the majority of the percussion that I do is actually with my push controller over here and doing it with like MIDI program drums. For vocals, my main microphones are the Shure SM7B, which I'm using right now, and a condenser microphone. It was actually handmade by Travis from a couple streams on Twitch. If you haven't seen them, definitely check them out. I will link their website and their Twitch channel in the description if you're interested in that. I switch back and forth whenever I feel like changing up my sound, but I have found that dynamic mics do work slightly better for looping because you can't hear the instruments, and like when you pick something up like a shaker, you do hear it, but it's not quite as loud and disruptive, I guess, as a condenser microphone where you're gonna hear every noise of me hitting the keyboard, pushing buttons, grabbing an instrument, setting it down, things like that. For someone that's first starting with looping and isn't sure what instrument to use, I would highly recommend a digital keyboard for the versatility. Because when I first started looping, I was like, what route do I go? Which instrument should I learn? And knowing what I know now, I would definitely start with the keyboard because you can do piano or you could change it up to synthesizers, bass, you can do your percussion with it. You can just really play around with a lot of different sounds with the keyboard. So I would say it's like the most versatile instrument for looping. Some keyboards, like the one that I have, actually have MIDI functionality, so that's even more handy if you're using Ableton. So something to think about. Okay, so let's talk about MIDI controllers. There are tons of options out there, so you can find what works best for you. I use Ableton, so it made sense to get the push controller. I have the Push 2, which is my favorite MIDI controller because of all the functionality it has and how you can see the Ableton screen at the top and not have to look at your monitors, which is really useful in a performance setting. I use my push controller for the MIDI loops, not so much the audio loops, which I will explain more about that later. Mostly because you can adjust the sound of the MIDI instruments on the fly. So next I have the APC 40. This is my second favorite MIDI controller. I use it for audio loops like the violin, the microphone, and the guitar loops. I also have some dials that are mapped to the different effects like filters, reverb, delay, and more. I found that they made my loops just sound a lot more interesting and fun to play around with, so I felt like that was a really nice addition to my setup. So next we have the APC Mini. This one is just like the most basic MIDI controller. So it's just an expansion of my APC 40, which gives me more slots for different instruments to control, like the guitar loops and the mic loops, for example, and just start and stop them or launch scenes with that controller. I also do a little bit of volume mixing as well. Okay, and then we have the Stream Deck. I use this one for a lot of different things. It's so versatile. I can control OBS, other programs like my Philips Hue, light bulbs like you see behind me. I've also mapped some Ableton functions to it as well. I can add mic effects like reverb and delay, launch scenes, mute different instruments. Any way to turn a multiple button function into one button is going to help you out a lot. So just for example, Control Z, that's 2 different buttons that you have to press, right? So if you can map that to something in your setup so that it's one single button press, anything to cut down the time it takes to build up a loop, or if you make a mistake, like the undo button is my favorite button. So if you make a mistake, as quickly as you can erase that mistake so your audience doesn't hear it, the better, right? So I've actually mapped my undo button to one of these buttons on the side of my mouse here, and you can just do that. This is a Logitech mouse, so it has software built into it, so you can program them. So if you have something like that, super useful. But also some MIDI controllers, like the push controller, has an undo button, which is one of my most used buttons, I think, probably on the push. Okay, next is my foot controller, which I use the Nektar Pacer. It's a MIDI foot controller, super versatile as well. This thing is awesome for recording instrument loops that I can't reach with my hands. So let's say I'm playing guitar or playing violin, I need to use my feet, right? So I can record loops and also use it as an effects pedal for the guitar and violin to add distortion, wah, extra reverb, things like that as well. So as I mentioned before, my keyboard it's called the Arturia Keylab Essential 88 key. It has MIDI functionality, which is really nice because you never know when you might want some extra MIDI functionality. I will say though, for my setup, I wish I got a smaller keyboard because I don't use all 88 keys. And so I just have this gigantic keyboard that I only use like half of, maybe 75% of it. So I wish that I would have gotten a smaller keyboard. So I don't know, just food for thought if you are looking into getting a keyboard. So last but not least, this isn't a MIDI controller, but I just kind of wanted to tell you about my audio interface that I use. I use the Focusrite 18i8 interface. And I chose this one because it has 4 XLR inputs on the front and some extra 1/4-inch inputs on the backside for extra instruments. Since I have so many instruments in my setup, I needed an interface that has lots of inputs. As far as getting my audio into Ableton and then into OBS, I use an SPDIF cable for that and use the software like Focusrite Control to route the audio from Ableton to OBS. All right, guys, so yeah, that pretty much sums it up. So I hope you found this video useful if you're somebody looking into looping, live streaming, or somebody just curious about different options and looking into a different looping solution. A lot of my setup is based off of muscle memory, so it does take a lot of practice, just like all looping setups do. So let me know if there's anything else that you want to know in the comments, and don't forget to like this video and smash the subscribe button for more tutorials and music that I have on my channel. Links to my Twitch channel and my social media places will be in the description of this video, and I will see you guys in the next one.